The Wedding Prelude. The warm sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of the small chapel, casting multicolored beams that danced across the pews. Friends and family gathered, their whispers filling the air with an excited buzz. Everyone awaited the big moment, David Matthews' wedding to his fiancée, Emily. It was meant to be a day filled with joy and celebration. Yet there was one person in the chapel who felt a growing sense of dread. 8-year-old Ethan Matthews stood near the altar, clutching a small satin pillow that held the wedding rings. His suit was neatly pressed, matching his father's tuxedo, but the boy's dark brown eyes were clouded with worry. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. While everyone else saw Emily as the picture of beauty and grace, Ethan had witnessed a side of her that no one else had seen, a side that chilled him to the core. Ethan glanced up at his father, who stood tall and proud at the altar, beaming with anticipation. David was a good man, a hard-working single father who had poured all of his love and energy into raising his son after Ethan's mother passed away 2 years earlier. David deserved happiness, and when he met Emily, it seemed like a new chapter was beginning for both of them. But Ethan knew deep down that Emily wasn't what she appeared to be. As the first notes of the wedding march played from the chapel's small organ, the congregation rose to their feet. The large oak doors at the back of the room slowly opened, revealing Emily in her pristine white gown. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and her blue eyes shimmered with emotion as she stepped forward, radiating beauty. The guests collectively sighed in admiration, their gazes fixed on the bride. All except for Ethan. His eyes remained locked on his father, who looked at Emily as if she were the answer to all his prayers. "You look beautiful," David whispered as she reached his side at the altar. Emily smiled softly, her voice sweet and delicate. "Thank you, David. I can't wait to start our life together." For everyone else, it was the start of a love story that had reached its pinnacle with this wedding. But for Ethan, it was something else entirely. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as memories of the past few months came rushing back. Memories that made him question everything about the woman his father was about to marry. Ethan's mind drifted back to the first time he met Emily. It had been a bright fall afternoon, the leaves on the trees painted shades of red and gold. David had picked him up from school that day, his excitement barely contained. "I got someone special I want you to meet, buddy," his father had said as they drove home. Ethan had felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. Since his mother's death, it had always just been him and his dad. The idea of someone new entering their lives made him uneasy. When they pulled up to the house, Emily was waiting on the front porch. She was smiling brightly, her golden hair catching the sunlight, and Ethan remembered how his father's face lit up at the sight of her. "Ethan, this is Emily." David had introduced her proudly. "She's become very important to me, and I hope she'll be important to you too." Emily had knelt down to Ethan's level, her blue eyes twinkling as she extended her hand. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Ethan. Your dad talks about you all the time." Ethan had shaken her hand, feeling a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this woman would bring happiness back into their lives. But over time, that hope began to fade. As the months went on, Ethan started to notice things about Emily that didn't sit right with him. Small things at first, like how her smile would disappear the moment David left the room, or how her eyes would narrow when she thought no one was watching. But it wasn't until she began to show her true colors when David wasn't around that Ethan realized something was wrong. It had started with subtle comments. When his father was working late and Emily was tasked with watching him, she would barely acknowledge his presence. One night, as they sat at the dinner table, Ethan tried to make conversation. "Miss Emily, do you like space? We're learning about the solar system in school," Ethan had asked timidly, hoping to spark some interest. Without looking up from her phone, Emily had cut him off sharply. "I'm busy right now, Ethan. Eat your dinner quietly." The coldness in her tone sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He had slumped back in his chair, pushing his food around on his plate. The excitement of sharing what he was learning at school instantly deflated. But when David came home later that night, Emily was all smiles again, asking Ethan how his day was and laughing at his jokes. To anyone watching, she seemed the perfect partner for his dad. But Ethan knew better. As the weeks turned into months, Emily's behavior became more erratic. She would snap at Ethan over small things, like leaving his toys out or accidentally spilling his juice. She would make cutting remarks that left him feeling small and unwanted. "You're such a handful sometimes," she would sigh when David wasn't around. "I don't know how your father manages." The worst incident happened just a few months before the wedding. David had left the house to run some errands, leaving Ethan and Emily alone. Ethan was watching cartoons in the living room when Emily stormed in. "Turn that off," she snapped, her voice dripping with irritation. "It's too loud. I'm trying to work." Startled, Ethan fumbled with the remote, accidentally knocking over his glass of juice. The liquid spilled across the coffee table, and before he could react, Emily was in front of him, her fingers digging painfully into his arm. "Look what you've done," she hissed, her face twisted in anger. "You clumsy, careless boy." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes. "I'm sorry," he whimpered. "I didn't mean to." But Emily didn't care. She tightened her grip on his arm, her eyes flashing with fury. "If you tell your father about this," she growled, her voice low and dangerous, "you'll be very sorry." Ethan had nodded, terrified of what she might do. That night, he had gone to bed with a bruise on his arm and a heavy heart. He wanted to tell his father the truth about Emily, but he was too scared. He knew how much David loved her, and he didn't want to ruin the happiness his father had found. As Ethan stood in the chapel now, watching Emily make her way toward his father, the weight of that secret pressed down on him like a stone. He wanted to scream, to tell everyone that this wedding was a mistake, but his voice was caught in his throat. The ceremony began, the officiant's words floating through the air as if carried on the breeze. But Ethan barely heard them. His thoughts were consumed with the memory of something he had overheard just a few nights ago. Emily had been on the phone late at night, her voice hushed but filled with anger. Ethan had crept down the hallway, careful to stay out of sight. "Mark, you need to listen to me," Emily had whispered fiercely into the phone. "We can't rush this. Everything has to be perfect." There was a pause, and then she continued, her voice dripping with frustration. "Once the wedding is done, we move on to phase 2. Yes, the insurance policy. David doesn't suspect a thing." Ethan had felt his heart stop. Insurance policy. Phase 2. What did it all mean? Now, standing in the chapel, his heart raced as he recalled that conversation. He had to do something. He couldn't let his father marry this woman, not when he knew she was hiding something dangerous. As the officiant asked if anyone objected to the marriage, Ethan knew it was his moment. His hands trembling, he stepped forward, his voice small but firm. "I do." The chapel fell silent. All eyes turned toward Ethan, who stood alone at the front of the room, his small frame trembling with the weight of what he was about to say. His father looked down at him. Confusion and concern etched on his face. "Ethan, what are you doing?" David asked gently. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, I have to tell you something. About Emily." A revelation unfolds. The chapel fell into a stunned silence as Ethan's small voice echoed through the grand space. All eyes turned toward him, the young boy standing at the front, clutching the ring pillow so tightly his knuckles were white. His legs trembled beneath him, but he remained rooted to the spot, knowing that what he was about to say could change everything. "Ethan." David's voice was filled with a mix of confusion and concern. He stepped away from Emily, looking down at his son with an expression that was equal parts bewilderment and worry. "What are you doing, son?" Ethan swallowed hard, his heart hammering in his chest. His father had always told him that honesty was one of the most important values, but in this moment, he realized that telling the truth wasn't just about being honest. It was about being brave. Taking a deep breath, he raised his head and looked his father directly in the eye. "Dad, there's something you need to know about Emily." His voice shook, but he forced himself to keep speaking, even as his eyes darted nervously toward the woman standing beside his father. Emily's smile, which had been serene and glowing just moments ago, faltered. Her blue eyes, which had always seemed so kind in public, narrowed slightly, a flicker of something darker flashing across her face. She quickly regained her composure, turning to David with a concerned smile. "David," she said softly, her voice oozing sweetness, "he's just nervous. It's a big day for him too. Maybe we should take a little break." But David, still focused on Ethan, didn't move. The confusion in his eyes deepened as he knelt in front of his son, bringing them eye to eye. "Ethan," he said softly, "whatever it is, you can tell me. What's going on?" For a moment, Ethan hesitated. He could feel the weight of every guest's eyes on him, the pressure of the moment making it hard to breathe. But he had come too far to back down now. His father needed to know the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. "Emily, she's not who you think she is," Ethan said, his voice barely more than a whisper, but the words reverberated through the chapel like a cannon blast. Gasps echoed through the room. David blinked in surprise, his face tightening with disbelief. He glanced at Emily, who now looked visibly flustered, before turning his attention back to Ethan. "What do you mean, Ethan?" David asked, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of tension. Ethan took another deep breath. He could feel his legs shaking, his throat tightening, but he had to keep going. She's mean to me when you're not around. She yells at me for little things, and one time she grabbed me so hard it hurt." He instinctively touched his arm where the bruise had long since faded, but the memory still lingered fresh in his mind. And I heard her talking on the phone late at night. She said something about an insurance policy. And phase 2. She said you didn't suspect anything. David's face drained of color, his usually warm and confident demeanor faltering. He looked over at Emily, who had gone completely still. For the first time, Ethan saw a glint of fear in her eyes. "Ethan," David began, but his voice trailed off as though he didn't know what to say. Before David could speak again, Emily quickly stepped forward, her expression carefully crafted to look calm, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. "David, please," she said, placing a hand on his arm in a soothing gesture. "He's just confused. He's probably feeling overwhelmed with everything going on. I'd never hurt him. He's just—" "No." Ethan's voice cut through her explanation like a blade. His hands clenched into fists, the fear and frustration that had built up over months finally spilling over. "I'm not lying. You're not nice to me when Dad isn't around. You pretend to be nice, but you're not. And you talked to someone on the phone at night, and you said something bad was going to happen after the wedding." Emily's face, usually so poised and composed, twisted into a mask of barely concealed fury. For a split second, her true self slipped through, and Ethan saw the cold, calculating expression he had come to fear. But she quickly covered it with a look of hurt, turning to David with wide, imploring eyes. "David, you know I love Ethan," she said, her voice trembling with feigned emotion. "I've always tried my best to make him feel comfortable, to be there for him. I don't know where all this is coming from, but I swear to you, it's not true. Maybe he's acting out because he misses his mother, or because he's not ready for this change." David stood frozen, torn between his son's accusations and the woman he was about to marry. He looked back and forth between Ethan and Emily, clearly struggling to make sense of the situation. The guests, who had been quietly whispering among themselves, now sat in complete silence, every eye in the chapel fixed on the unfolding drama. Ethan's heart sank as he watched his father hesitate. He had been so sure that once his dad knew the truth, everything would be okay. But now, seeing the doubt on David's face, he wasn't so sure anymore. What if his father didn't believe him? What if Emily had already poisoned his mind too much? Before David could respond, A sudden voice from the back of the chapel broke the silence. "Hold on a minute." The guests turned in their seats as a man stepped forward, his dark suit impeccably tailored, his stride confident. He was tall, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce through the room. Ethan had never seen him before, but something about the man sent a chill down his spine. "Who are you?" David asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and irritation. The man smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, cold and calculating. "I'm Mark," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I believe you've heard my name mentioned, haven't you, Ethan?" Ethan's blood ran cold. Mark. That was the name he had heard Emily say on the phone, the man she had been speaking to late at night. David's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about? What's going on here?" Mark's eyes flicked toward Emily, and for the first time, real fear flickered in her eyes. She took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching out as if to stop him from speaking. "Mark, don't." "Don't what, Emily?" Mark interrupted, his voice still maddeningly calm. "Don't tell him the truth. I think the boy's already done a pretty good job of that, don't you?" David's face went pale as he looked between Emily and Mark, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "What's going on?" Emily's composure crumbled. She took a step forward, her voice trembling. "David, I can explain." But Mark cut her off with a cold laugh. "Oh, Emily, always thinking you can talk your way out of anything." He turned to David, his smile now gone. "It's simple, really. Emily here was planning to marry you, get her name on your life insurance policy, and then, well, let's just say she wasn't planning on being a widow for long." A collective gasp rippled through the room. David staggered back, as though the weight of the revelation had physically hit him. His eyes darted between Emily and Mark, struggling to process what he had just heard. Emily reached out, her voice desperate. "David, it's not true. He's lying. I would never." "Shut up, Emily," Mark said, his voice suddenly ice-cold. "You've been caught. The boy overheard your little plan, and now it's over." For a moment, no one moved. The chapel was so silent that the ticking of the clock could be heard clearly. Then, with a sudden burst of fury, Emily lunged toward Mark, her eyes blazing with anger. "You ruined everything," she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. David, stunned and horrified, stepped in front of Ethan protectively, his mind reeling as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. He looked at Emily, the woman he had been ready to marry, and saw a stranger standing before him. A dangerous, manipulative stranger. Without another word, David turned to the nearest guest. "Call 911, he said, his voice shaking with anger. Now. The fallout. The world seemed to spin in slow motion as the weight of the revelation settled over the chapel like a thick, suffocating fog. The guests, who moments before had been celebrating what should have been a joyous occasion, now sat in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and disbelief. The murmur of whispered conversations began to fill the space, growing louder as people tried to process the bombshell that had just exploded in front of them. David Matthews stood motionless, his hand still resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder. His face, which had once been alight with joy and anticipation, was now ashen, his eyes wide with disbelief. His heart pounded in his chest, a dull roar filling his ears as he tried to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. Emily, the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he had trusted to help rebuild the life he had lost after his wife's death, was not who he thought she was. She was a liar, a manipulator, a fraud. And worst of all, she had planned to hurt him, maybe even kill him, for money. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. How had he been so blind? How had he not seen the warning signs, the subtle manipulations, the way Emily had distanced him from Ethan, the most important person in his life? His son had tried to tell him, and he hadn't listened. The guilt washed over him in waves, each one heavier than the last. Mark stood at the front of the chapel, his arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold with a smirk playing on his lips. He had exposed Emily's plan with cold precision, as though this were all a game to him. He was the one who had been on the other end of Emily's late-night phone calls, the one who had helped orchestrate the twisted scheme that had nearly destroyed David's life. But he seemed completely unfazed by the gravity of the situation, as if he were simply observing the fallout of a plan that had failed, not out of malice, but out of boredom. Emily, on the other hand, was anything but calm. Her entire demeanor had shifted in the blink of an eye. The sweet, composed woman who had glided down the aisle just moments before was gone, replaced by someone darker, someone desperate. Her face was contorted with rage, her eyes wild as she glared at Mark with a hatred that was palpable. "You ruined everything." Emily spat, her voice filled with venom, as she lunged toward Mark, her hands clenched into fists. "You were supposed to keep your mouth shut." Mark didn't flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening as he easily sidestepped her attack. "Come on, Emily," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Did you really think I was going to let you have all the fun? You've always been so dramatic." David, still in shock, turned to one of the guests sitting closest to the aisle. "Please, call the police," he said quietly, his voice trembling with the effort to remain calm. He didn't wait for a response, his mind too overwhelmed to focus on anything other than protecting his son from the chaos that had erupted around them. The guest, a middle-aged woman wearing a floral dress, quickly pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. The whispers in the chapel grew louder, spreading like wildfire as the other guests began to realize the gravity of the situation. She was going to kill him. "I can't believe this. Did you hear what that man said?" David could hear their words, but they felt distant, like the hum of static in the background of his thoughts. His mind was racing, replaying the past few months over and over again, trying to piece together the clues he had missed. How had he let it get this far? How had he been so blind to the danger lurking right under his nose? Emily, now pacing furiously, turned her attention back to David, her expression shifting from anger to desperation. "David, you can't believe him," she pleaded, her voice trembling with a new kind of urgency. "This is all a lie. He's trying to ruin us. He's jealous. He always has been." David's eyes met hers, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of the love he had once felt for her. But it was quickly swallowed by the anger and betrayal that now pulsed through his veins. He shook his head slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan told me. He tried to warn me, and I didn't listen. I didn't want to believe it." Emily's face crumpled, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, David, please. You have to believe me. I love you. I love you and Ethan. This is just a misunderstanding. We can fix this. We can still." "Enough." David's voice cracked like a whip, cutting through her frantic rambling. He took a step back, pulling Ethan closer to him. "It's over, Emily. Whatever this was, whatever you thought you could do, it's over." Emily's tears dried instantly, her face hardening into a mask of cold fury. She glanced at Mark, who was still watching the scene with detached amusement, then back at David. Her lips curled into a sneer. "Fine. Believe what you want. But don't think you're some hero in all of this, David. You're just as blind and pathetic as the rest of them." Before anyone could react, Emily turned on her heel and stormed toward the chapel doors. But before she could make it out, the sound of police sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached the small church. The guests craned their necks to see what was happening, their curiosity piqued by the escalating drama. Within minutes, 2 police officers entered the chapel, their presence commanding the room. One of the officers, a tall man with a no-nonsense expression, stepped forward. "We received a report of a disturbance," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd before landing on David and Emily. Can someone explain what's going on here? David, still reeling from the whirlwind of events, opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Emily stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Officers, I can explain everything," she said, her voice suddenly calm and composed again, as though she had rehearsed this moment. "There's been a misunderstanding." The officer narrowed his eyes, clearly not convinced by her sudden change in demeanor. "We'll hear from everyone," he said, his tone firm. He gestured to his partner, who stepped forward with a notepad ready to take statements from the key witnesses. Ethan, who had been silent this entire time, tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I don't want her to hurt you." David looked down at his son, his heart breaking at the sight of the fear in his eyes. He crouched down to Ethan's level, placing both hands on his shoulders. "Ethan, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have listened to you. I should have known something was wrong." Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but he shook his head. "It's not your fault, Dad. I didn't want her to hurt you." David pulled Ethan into a tight hug, his heart aching with the weight of the guilt he felt. He had been so blinded by his own desire for happiness that he had ignored the one person who mattered most, his son. As David held Ethan close, one of the officers approached them. "Sir, can you tell us what happened?" The officer asked, his tone soft but serious. David took a deep breath, his mind still spinning. "Emily, she was planning something. I don't know the full details, but my son overheard her talking about an insurance policy, about something happening after the wedding. And this man," he gestured to Mark, who was still standing nearby, watching the proceedings with a smirk. "He's involved somehow." The officer nodded, taking notes as David spoke. "We'll need to take statements from everyone," he said, glancing at Ethan. "Especially your son. It sounds like he knows more than anyone else here." Ethan nodded, wiping the tears from his eyes. "I heard her talking on the phone," he said, his voice small but steady. "She was saying that after the wedding, something bad was going to happen. She didn't think Dad would know, but I heard her. She was talking to him." He pointed at Mark. Mark raised his hands in mock innocence. "Hey, I was just following orders," he said, his tone casual. "Emily's the mastermind here, not me." The officer shot him a stern look. "You'll have a chance to explain yourself at the station." Mark's smirk faltered slightly, but he remained silent. As the officers began to lead Emily and Mark away, the guests watched in stunned silence, their faces pale with shock. David stood in the center of the room, still holding Ethan close, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, guilt, anger. It all mixed together in a confusing storm. The woman he had planned to marry was gone. His trust had been shattered, his heart broken. But as he looked down at Ethan, who had bravely stepped forward to save him, he knew that they would get through this together. As the chapel doors closed behind Emily and Mark, the weight of the ordeal slowly began to lift. David knelt down in front of his son, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. "You saved me, Ethan. You were brave when I wasn't. I'll never forget that." Ethan sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "I just didn't want her to hurt you, Dad." David pulled him into another hug, holding him tight. "She won't, Ethan. She won't hurt us ever again." The aftermath. The dust had settled, but the air in the small chapel still felt heavy, almost suffocating. David Matthews, his emotions swirling like a storm within him, stood in the middle of the now empty room, clutching Ethan's small hand in his own. The police had taken Emily and Mark away, their betrayal leaving a gaping wound in the fabric of David's life that he wasn't sure would ever fully heal. The guests had dispersed, whispering in stunned disbelief as they filed out of the chapel, some casting sympathetic glances toward David and Ethan, while others simply shook their heads in bewilderment at what they had just witnessed. David could hardly process it himself. The woman he had planned to spend the rest of his life with, the woman he had trusted to help him rebuild his family, had been plotting against him all along. She had deceived him, manipulated him, and worst of all, she had hurt his son. Ethan's small braid voice echoing through the chapel still rang in David's ears, and each time he thought about how close he had come to marrying a woman who had no love for either of them, his stomach turned. "Dad." Ethan's voice was soft, uncertain. He tugged gently at David's sleeve, looking up at him with wide, anxious eyes. David snapped out of his daze and knelt down in front of his son, his heart heavy with guilt. He placed both hands on Ethan's shoulders, his voice cracking as he spoke. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I should have listened to you from the beginning. I should have known something was wrong." Ethan's face was a mixture of emotions, relief, confusion, and the remnants of fear. "It's okay, Dad," he said quietly, though his voice trembled slightly. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to make you upset." David's heart clenched. How had he missed it? His son had been suffering in silence, trying to protect him from the very person who had been threatening their family. David pulled Ethan into a tight embrace, holding him close as if he could somehow shield him from all the pain and fear that had been inflicted. "It's not okay," David whispered into Ethan's hair. "I should have protected you. You shouldn't have had to deal with any of this on your own." They stayed like that for a long moment, the quiet of the empty chapel surrounding them. David could feel the weight of the past few months pressing down on him. The sleepless nights, the subtle changes in Ethan's behavior that he had brushed off as normal growing pains, the moments when Emily's charm had made him feel like he was finally moving on from the grief of losing his wife. All of it now seemed like a cruel joke, a lie that had nearly destroyed the most important relationship in his life. When they finally pulled apart, David looked down at Ethan's tear-streaked face and forced a small smile. "We're going to be okay," he said, more to reassure himself than his son. "We'll get through this. Together." Ethan nodded, though his expression remained serious. "Are they going to jail?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David took a deep breath. "I don't know, buddy," he admitted. "But the police will handle it now. We don't have to worry about Emily or Mark anymore." The mention of Mark's name brought a bitter taste to David's mouth. He had been the final piece of the puzzle, the one who had exposed Emily's scheme. In some twisted way, David knew that without Mark's intervention, he might have never known the full extent of what Emily had planned. But that didn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. Mark had been part of the plan from the beginning, and the thought that two people had conspired to take advantage of him, of his love, of his vulnerability, made David's blood boil. He wanted answers, but right now, his priority was Ethan. They had been through enough for one day. As they stood to leave the chapel, David caught sight of the ring box still sitting on the altar, the small satin pillow lying discarded on the floor. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. What was meant to be a symbol of love and commitment had become a stark reminder of how fragile trust could be. He bent down and picked up the ring box, staring at the gleaming gold bands inside. For a moment, he felt the crushing weight of everything he had lost. His dream of building a new life with Emily, the trust he had so easily given, the happiness he had thought was finally within his reach. But as he closed the box and slipped it into his pocket, he reminded himself that the most important thing hadn't been lost. Ethan was still here. His son, who had shown more courage than David ever could have imagined, was safe. And for now, that was all that mattered. The days following the wedding that never was were a blur of police interviews, legal proceedings, and media attention that David could have done without. The story of the ruined wedding had made headlines, sensationalized by the revelation that Emily had been plotting to use David for financial gain. Reporters swarmed the small town, eager for interviews and statements, but David kept to himself, refusing to speak publicly about what had happened. Instead, he focused on Ethan, trying to rebuild the sense of normalcy that had been shattered. He took time off work to be with his son, making sure that Ethan knew he was there for him, that he was listening now in a way he hadn't before. At first, Ethan was quiet, withdrawn. The fear that had taken root during the months he had spent under Emily's cold gaze didn't disappear overnight. He clung to David more than usual, seeking reassurance that the nightmare was truly over. David could see the toll it had taken on his son, the worry lines on his young face, the way he hesitated to speak up, as if he were still afraid of being silenced or not believed. But slowly, as the days passed, Ethan began to open up. They spent long afternoons together in the backyard, tossing a baseball or building forts out of old blankets, the simplicity of their time together a balm for both of them. David took him on hikes, just like they used to before Emily came into their lives, the two of them exploring the woods near their home, the quiet rhythm of nature helping them both heal. One evening, about a week after the wedding, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, the air warm and still. Ethan was sitting next to David, his legs curled up beneath him, a glass of lemonade in his hands. "Dad?" Ethan's voice was quiet, but it no longer carried the same weight of fear it had before. David looked over at him, grateful for the sound of his son's voice. "Yeah, buddy." Ethan hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "Do you think we'll ever, have a family again, like with someone else?" The question caught David off guard, but he didn't shy away from it. He had been wondering the same thing himself, though the thought of opening his heart to someone else after what had happened felt impossible at the moment. "I don't know," David answered honestly, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Maybe one day. But for now, we've got each other. And that's enough for me." Ethan looked up at his father, his eyes searching for reassurance. "I don't want to have a new mom if she's going to be like Emily," he admitted, his voice small but steady. David's heart broke a little at the thought of the damage Emily had done to Ethan's trust, but he smiled gently and ruffled his son's hair. "I don't either, kiddo. But if we ever do meet someone else, we'll make sure she's someone who really loves us. Someone who's kind and honest, and you'll always come first, I promise." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful as he sipped his lemonade. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the last rays of the sun disappear behind the horizon. "I'm glad it's just us right now," Ethan said softly, leaning his head against David's arm. "I like it when it's just you and me." David smiled, his heart swelling with love for the boy beside him. "Me too, Ethan. Me too." And in that moment, as the night settled in around them, David knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Stronger than before, a father and son, bound by love and resilience. The road to healing. The house was quieter now. After the chaos of the wedding that never was, the whirlwind of police interviews, and the media frenzy that had consumed their small town, David Matthews and his son Ethan were finally starting to settle into a new kind of normal. It wasn't the life David had envisioned, certainly not the one he had been so close to stepping into with Emily. But in the quiet moments, he found himself grateful. Grateful for the second chance to rebuild trust with his son. Grateful for the truth coming to light before it was too late. And most of all, grateful that he and Ethan had emerged from the nightmare together, stronger in ways David hadn't expected. But healing wasn't linear, and it wasn't easy. It wasn't as simple as returning to the life they'd known before Emily's arrival. The scars she'd left, particularly on Ethan, weren't visible, but they ran deep. And as the days turned into weeks, David realized that moving forward meant confronting those scars head-on, not just pretending that everything had gone back to the way it was. Ethan had always been a quiet child, introspective and thoughtful, but since Emily's betrayal, his silence had become more pronounced. There were moments when David caught his son staring off into space, his brow furrowed in deep concentration, as if he were wrestling with questions he wasn't ready to ask. And when he did speak, there was often a cautiousness in his voice, as though he were still testing the waters, unsure if he could trust the world around him to be as it seemed. One evening, about a month after the disastrous wedding day, David found Ethan sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at a framed photo of their family, David, Ethan, and Ethan's mother, taken back when life had felt simpler, safer. Ethan's small hands clutched the frame, his eyes locked on the image of his mother, who had passed away 2 years earlier. David's heart ached as he watched his son, knowing that no matter how much time passed, there were wounds that simply couldn't be mended with words. He had been so focused on trying to rebuild their lives after Ethan's mother died that he hadn't noticed how much weight his son was still carrying. And Emily had only added to that weight, a burden that no child should ever have to bear. Ethan, David said softly, stepping into the room. He didn't want to startle his son, but he also didn't want to avoid the difficult conversations any longer. They couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Ethan didn't look up right away, but after a few moments, he set the photo down on his nightstand and turned to face his father. "Yeah, Dad." His voice was quiet, a little hesitant, as though he wasn't sure what David was going to say next. David sat down beside him on the bed, resting his hands on his knees as he took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "about everything that's happened, about what you went through with Emily, and how I didn't see what was going on until it was almost too late." Ethan looked down at his hands, his small fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "It wasn't your fault, Dad," he said quietly. "I didn't really know how to tell you, and I didn't want to make you sad." David's heart clenched at those words. His son had been protecting him, trying to carry the weight of the truth on his own, because he hadn't wanted to hurt his father. It was a burden no child should have to carry, and the guilt David felt was almost overwhelming. "You shouldn't have had to protect me, Ethan," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been the one protecting you. I should have seen the signs, should have listened when you tried to tell me something was wrong. I was so caught up in my own happiness, in the idea of starting over, that I didn't realize I was putting you in a situation that wasn't safe. And for that, I'm so sorry." Ethan finally looked up at his father, his eyes wide and filled with a mixture of emotions, confusion, sadness, but also a glimmer of understanding. "I didn't want you to be mad," he admitted. "I thought maybe you'd be mad at me for not liking Emily, and she was nice when you were around. So I thought maybe I was just wrong." David shook his head, his chest tightening with the realization of just how deep Emily's manipulation had gone. "You were never wrong, Ethan," he said firmly. "Emily wasn't who she pretended to be, and I should have seen that. But from now on, I want you to know that no matter what, you can always come to me, even if you think I won't like what you have to say. I'll always listen. I promise." Ethan's lip trembled slightly, and for a moment, David thought his son might cry. But instead, Ethan simply nodded, the weight of his father's words sinking in. It was a small moment, but it was a step toward healing, toward rebuilding the trust that had been damaged by Emily's lies. They sat in silence for a while, the room filled with the soft hum of the evening air outside. David didn't rush Ethan, didn't try to fill the silence with empty words. Instead, he let the quiet stretch between them, allowing his son to take his time. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think I'll ever stop feeling scared? Like, what if someone else comes into our lives, and they're like Emily?" David's heart broke a little at the question, but he knew that honesty was the only way forward. "I don't know if the fear will ever completely go away," he admitted gently. "It's okay to be scared after something like this. But the important thing is that we learn from it. We'll be more careful in the future. We'll trust each other and talk to each other when something doesn't feel right. And we'll take our time." Ethan was quiet for a moment, absorbing his father's words. "So, if you ever meet someone new, you'll make sure she's really nice, and that she really likes me." David smiled softly, reaching out to ruffle Ethan's hair. "Absolutely. You're my #1 priority, Ethan. Anyone who comes into our lives has to love both of us, and if she doesn't, she's not staying." Ethan smiled at that, a small, shy smile, but it was enough to warm David's heart. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. The months that followed were filled with slow, steady steps toward healing. David made a conscious effort to focus on the little things: weekend trips to the park, movie nights, lazy afternoons spent building forts in the living room. He wanted to give Ethan the space to just be a kid again, to remember what it felt like to live without the shadow of fear hanging over him. They returned to old routines that had been disrupted during Emily's time in their lives. Every Saturday morning, David and Ethan would wake up early and head to the local diner for pancakes, a tradition that had started when Ethan was just 5 years old. The familiar faces of the waitresses and the smell of syrup and bacon were comforting, a reminder of the simple joys they had once taken for granted. On Sundays, they'd go for hikes in the nearby woods, just the two of them, exploring the winding trails and listening to the sounds of nature. It was during these hikes that Ethan seemed to open up the most, his young mind processing everything that had happened in his own time, in his own way. One afternoon, as they sat on a fallen log deep in the woods, Ethan turned to David with a question that had clearly been weighing on him for some time. "Do you think Mom would be proud of us?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. David felt a lump rise in his throat at the mention of Ethan's mother. It had been 2 years since she passed, but her memory was still a constant presence in their lives. He had often wondered how she would have handled everything that had happened with Emily, whether she would have seen through the lies faster than he had, whether she would have been able to protect Ethan in a way that David had failed to. But he also knew that the strength they had shown, the resilience, the love that had carried them through the darkest moments, was something his late wife would have admired. "I think she would be very proud," David said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "Of both of us." Ethan looked thoughtful for a moment, then smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I think so too," he said, his voice filled with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. It was in these moments, in the quiet spaces between the business of life, that David saw the real progress being made. The nightmares that had once plagued Ethan's sleep began to fade, replaced by the comfort of knowing that he was safe. The fear that had once gripped him so tightly began to loosen its hold, and slowly, bit by bit, Ethan started to reclaim his sense of security. And through it all, David found himself healing too. The guilt that had weighed him down, the self-blame that had gnawed at him since the day the truth about Emily came to light, began to soften. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the mistakes he had made, but he could learn from them. He could become the father Ethan needed him to be, the one who listened, who protected, who was present. As the seasons changed, the wounds that Emily had inflicted on their lives began to heal, leaving behind scars that told a story of survival, of resilience, of love. David and Ethan weren't the same as they had been before Emily entered their lives, but in many ways they were stronger. They had faced the darkness together and come out the other side. And now, as they sat together on that log in the woods, they knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it as a team. A new beginning. Autumn had returned, casting the small town in warm hues of amber, crimson, and gold. The trees, now in their full fall glory, lined the streets with a gentle cascade of leaves that whispered as they fell. The air had turned crisp, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of bonfires and wood smoke. For David Matthews and his son, Ethan, it was more than just another change of season. It marked the close of one chapter and the beginning of another, a season of healing, of renewal, and of moving forward. It had been almost a year since the chaotic events of that ill-fated wedding day. In that time, David and Ethan had undergone a profound transformation, though the scars of the past still lingered. Trust, once shattered by betrayal, had been painstakingly rebuilt between them, their bond stronger than ever. But now, as they stood on the precipice of something new, David found himself thinking about the future in a way he hadn't allowed himself to for a long time. On a bright Saturday morning, David and Ethan set out for their usual pancake breakfast at the local diner. The same routine they had followed for years had, in many ways, become their sanctuary. The smell of syrup and fresh coffee greeted them as they walked through the door, and the familiar faces of the waitresses welcomed them warmly. This was their ritual, their place of comfort and familiarity, a reminder that life, no matter how complicated, always offered moments of simplicity. As they settled into their favorite booth by the window, Ethan seemed unusually quiet. David noticed, but he didn't push. He had learned over the past year that Ethan opened up when he was ready, not when he was prompted. Patience had become a cornerstone of their relationship, and David was willing to wait for his son to speak when the time was right. It wasn't until the waitress, Maggie, brought over their plates stacked high with pancakes that Ethan finally broke the silence. "Dad," he began, his voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about moving forward." David looked up from his plate, his fork paused midair. Ethan rarely initiated conversations like this, and it immediately piqued his interest. "Yeah, buddy," he asked, keeping his tone casual but encouraging. Ethan took a deep breath, pushing his fork through the syrupy stack in front of him. "Do you ever think about, finding someone else? Like, maybe not right now, but someday?" The question was simple, but it carried a depth of emotion that David hadn't expected. For months, they had carefully avoided talking about the possibility of someone new coming into their lives. The specter of Emily's betrayal still loomed large, and the idea of opening their hearts to another person had felt impossible. David set down his fork, leaning forward slightly. "I've thought about it," he admitted softly, "but only in the sense that, I don't want to rush anything. After everything we went through, I want to make sure we're both ready before we even think about something like that." Ethan nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I know. I don't want you to feel like you have to be alone forever, Dad. I know what happened with Emily was really bad, but," he hesitated, as if searching for the right words, "I think I'm okay with it. Someday, if it happens." David's heart swelled with both pride and sadness. His son had grown so much in the past year, not just physically, but emotionally. The way Ethan spoke now, with such maturity, was a testament to the strength he had developed through the challenges they had faced. It was a bittersweet reminder that while the events with Emily had been traumatic, they had also taught Ethan lessons about resilience, trust, and love that many people didn't learn until much later in life. "I appreciate that, Ethan," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want you to know something. No matter what happens in the future, you come first. Always. I don't want to bring anyone into our lives unless she's someone who truly cares about both of us, someone who treats you with the love and respect you deserve." Ethan's face softened, and he smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Thanks, Dad. I know." They continued their breakfast in comfortable silence, the unspoken understanding between them filling the air. As David watched his son methodically pour more syrup onto his pancakes, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel as daunting as it once had. Over the next few months, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. David returned to work full-time, but he made sure to carve out more time for Ethan. They spent their weekends hiking, playing catch in the backyard, and taking impromptu trips to the local ice cream shop. Ethan was doing better in school, his teachers noting how much more engaged and confident he had become. It seemed that with each passing week, the shadows of the past grew fainter, replaced by the light of new memories they were creating together. But David knew that healing was a journey, not a destination. There were still moments when Ethan would grow quiet, his thoughts drifting to darker places, and there were nights when David would wake to find his son standing at the foot of his bed, too afraid to sleep alone. Those moments reminded David that they were both still healing, and that it would take time for the trust they had rebuilt to fully solidify. It wasn't until the following spring that something unexpected happened, something that would challenge the newfound stability they had worked so hard to create. Her name was Claire. David had met her during one of his weekend hiking trips with Ethan. She had been walking her dog along the same trail, and they had struck up a casual conversation after the dog had bounded over to Ethan, wagging its tail enthusiastically. At first, David thought nothing of it. He was polite, friendly, but he hadn't considered the possibility of meeting anyone new. His heart was still guarded, and his focus was on Ethan. But as the weeks went by, David and Claire kept running into each other on the trail. Each time, they would chat for a little longer, their conversations ranging from the weather to their shared love of the outdoors. Claire had an easygoing nature, and there was something about her that put David at ease in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. One afternoon, as they were packing up their things after another hike, Ethan asked the question that had been on David's mind, but that he hadn't dared to voice. "Do you think we'll see Claire again?" David looked over at his son, surprised by the question. "Maybe," he said cautiously. "Why do you ask?" Ethan shrugged, but there was a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I like her dog. She's nice too. You seem to like talking to her." David felt a rush of conflicting emotions. He did enjoy talking to Claire. In fact, he had found himself looking forward to their brief encounters on the trail more than he cared to admit. But he was also wary of moving too fast, of getting attached, of putting Ethan in a position where his trust might be broken again. "She is nice," David agreed slowly. "But you know it's important that we take things slow, right? If I ever decide to spend more time with Claire or anyone else, I want to make sure you're comfortable with it. We've been through enough, and I don't want to do anything that might hurt you." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "I know, but it's okay, Dad. You don't have to worry about me all the time. I'll tell you if something doesn't feel right." David smiled, feeling the surge of pride once again at his son's maturity. "Deal," he said, ruffling Ethan's hair affectionately. As the weeks passed, David and Claire's friendship blossomed into something more. They began meeting up for coffee after their hikes, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Claire became a part of David and Ethan's routine. She was patient, never pushing for more than David was willing to give, and she took the time to get to know Ethan on his terms. She never tried to force her way into their lives. She simply let herself be present, offering warmth and kindness in a way that felt natural. Ethan, for his part, seemed to take to Claire easily. He appreciated her gentle approach and the fact that she never tried to replace his mother or act like a new stepmother. Instead, Claire simply became a friend, someone he could trust, someone who was there for both him and his dad in a way that felt right. It wasn't long before David realized that he was falling for her. But this time, things were different. David wasn't blinded by the rush of new love. He wasn't rushing into anything, wasn't ignoring the needs of his son. He was taking it slow, listening to Ethan's cues, and making sure that every step forward was taken with care. One evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the sunset, David turned to Ethan, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. "How are you feeling about everything?" he asked, his voice gentle. Ethan looked up at him, his face thoughtful. "I think it's good," he said slowly. "I like Claire. And I like that you're happy, Dad. I don't feel scared anymore." David's chest tightened with emotion, and he smiled. "I'm glad, Ethan. I'm really glad." And in that moment, David knew that they had truly entered a new chapter, a chapter not defined by the pain of the past, but by the love and trust they had rebuilt together. The road to healing had been long, but they had made it, together. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, David wrapped his arm around his son's shoulders, feeling the deep sense of peace. The future, once filled with uncertainty and fear, now felt full of hope. This was their new beginning, and this time it felt right. Epilogue. A new dawn. Months later, as the season shifted once more, David and Ethan stood on the same trail where they had first met Claire, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. Claire stood beside them, her dog happily sniffing around the fallen leaves. It was a peaceful day, the kind of day that made David feel grateful for how far they had come. Ethan, now more confident and sure of himself, laughed as the dog chased a squirrel up a tree. He looked back at his dad and Claire, his face lit up with joy, the shadows of the past far behind them. David reached out and took Claire's hand, a quiet smile on his face. As he looked at his son, he knew that this was what healing looked like, not erasing the past, but embracing the future with open hearts. A new beginning, full of love, trust, and hope. And for David and Ethan, that was more than enough.